The morning of May 9, 1943, was thick with the kind of low-hanging coastal fog that usually kept the RAF's interceptors grounded. At the RAF Dice airfield in Scotland, the radar operators were monitoring a quiet sky when a single blip appeared, crossing the North Sea from the direction of occupied Norway. This wasn't a mass formation of Heinkels or a high-altitude reconnaissance mission. It was a lone, twin-engine aircraft, flying low and fast, heading directly for British soil. As the silhouette broke through the mist, the ground crews scrambled. It was unmistakable, a Junkers Ju-88R1, the backbone of the German Luftwaffe's night fighter force. This was the Predator that had been thinning out the ranks of British Bomber Command for years. On the ground, the anti-aircraft batteries tracked the bomber, fingers hovering over triggers, waiting for the inevitable release of 500-pound bombs or the rattle of its nose-mounted cannons. But the attack never came. Instead of diving into a bombing run, the German pilot did something that defied every protocol of the war. At 500 feet, he slowed the aircraft to near-stalling speed. In a move that looked like a desperate dance, he began to wiggle the wings of the heavy Junkers, the universal pilot signal for, "I am not a threat." Seconds later, the heavy thud of the landing gear locking into place echoed across the runway. The British personnel watched in stunned silence as the German Wolf lowered its paws. It wasn't dropping fire, it was asking for a place to park. As the wheels touched the tarmac and the Merlin-like hum of the BMW engines faded into a hiss of cooling metal, the airfield was swarmed by armed RAF security. They expected a cockpit full of dead men or a cabin rigged with booby traps. What they found instead was a pilot with a calm, resolute expression, stepping out of the glass-canopied cockpit with his hands raised, offering the British something far more dangerous than any bomb, the Luftwaffe's most guarded secrets. To understand why Oberleutnant Herbert Schmid, often associated with this daring flight, and his crew, including Hans-Joachim Helmers, decided to commit the ultimate act of high-altitude treason, you have to look at the state of the Luftwaffe in 1943. By this point in the war, the romanticism of the Knights of the Air had been ground into the dirt. The German Air Force was being bled white, and for many seasoned pilots, the ideological fervor of the Nazi regime had been replaced by a cold mechanical realization. The war was lost, and they were being asked to die for a corpse. Schmid and Helmers weren't just disgruntled soldiers, they were elite specialists. They operated the Junkers Ju-88, a masterpiece of German engineering, but their specific aircraft was a technological crown jewel. It was equipped with the FUG 202 Lichtenstein BC radar, a top-secret array of stag's horn antennas protruding from the nose. This device allowed German night fighters to see British bombers through total darkness and thick cloud cover with terrifying precision. It was the single biggest obstacle to the Allied bombing campaign, a secret the Germans guarded with fanatical intensity. But Helmers was a man whose conscience had become as heavy as the aircraft he flew. He was tired of the endless cycle of nighttime slaughter and the increasingly desperate commands from Berlin. He didn't just want to survive the war, he wanted to end it. He realized that the gift he possessed, the Ju-88 and its radar, could do more to stop the bloodshed than any bullet. The plan was hatched in the shadows of an airfield in Kristiansand, Norway. It required more than just courage, it required a total betrayal of their comrades. They had to wait for a specific mission, one that would put them close enough to the North Sea to make a break for it without being intercepted by their own wolf pack. Helmers knew that the moment he turned his nose toward Scotland, he was no longer a decorated officer. He was a man without a country, flying a stolen piece of the future toward an enemy that would likely shoot him on sight. He wasn't just defecting, he was delivering the skeleton key to the Luftwaffe's defensive vault, knowing that if he failed, his name would be erased from German history, and if he succeeded, he would be the man who blinded the Third Reich. The escape was not a clean break, it was a high-stakes gauntlet through the most dangerous airspace in the world. As the Ju-88 climbed away from the Norwegian coast, the crew's hearts were hammering against their ribs. They had timed their departure to coincide with a routine patrol, but the Luftwaffe's ground controllers were elite. It didn't take long for the radar stations in occupied Norway to realize that one of their own wolves had broken formation and was heading 280 degrees, straight for Great Britain. The first threat came from behind. German interceptors were scrambled with a "destroy at all costs" order. The Luftwaffe would rather see their top-secret radar at the bottom of the North Sea than in the hands of the RAF. Schmid and Helmers pushed the BMW engines to their absolute limit, the airframe vibrating with the strain as they dove toward the wavetops. By flying low, they hoped to vanish into the sea clutter of the German radar, but the low altitude brought a new danger: the freezing spray of the North Sea and the constant threat of a single mechanical failure sending them into a watery grave. As they approached the Scottish coast, the danger shifted from German pursuit to British defense. To the RAF radar operators at Chain Home, the Junkers was just another incoming raid. They didn't see a defector. They saw a fast-moving German bomber coming to kill. Spitfires were scrambled from 602 Squadron, their pilots' fingers on the gun triggers as they dove toward the lone German aircraft. Helmers and Schmid were now trapped between two fires. If they sped up, the British would think they were attacking. If they slowed down, the Germans would catch them. Helmers began the desperation dance. He threw the heavy Junkers into a series of violent wing waggles, throwing the stag's horn antennas back and forth against the grey Scottish sky. They lowered their landing gear miles out to sea, a massive, drag-inducing signal of surrender. It was a terrifying gamble. At any second, a burst of .303 caliber fire from a Spitfire or a 40mm Bofors shell from a coastal battery could have ended the mission. They flew through a wall of suspicion, a lone German plane wiggling its wings in a silent scream for mercy. Guided into a landing at RAF Dice by pilots who were still wondering if they should pull the trigger. When the wheels of the WWII finally skidded to a halt on the tarmac at RAF Dice, the silence that followed was heavy with mutual distrust. As Schmid, Helmers, and their mechanics stepped out onto the wing with their hands high, they weren't greeted with open arms and medals. Instead, they found themselves staring down the barrels of dozens of Lee Enfield rifles. To the British soldiers on the ground, this wasn't a gift, it was a Trojan horse. The British intelligence officers of the Air Ministry were immediately skeptical. In the world of high-stakes espionage, things rarely fell into your lap this perfectly. They feared that the entire flight was a masterful Nazi ruse. Perhaps the plane was packed with high explosives set on a timer, designed to detonate once it was tucked safely inside a British hangar, taking out top RAF engineers. Or, even more subtly, they feared the radar equipment itself was rigged, designed to feed the British false frequencies that would lead their bombers into a trap over Berlin. While Helmers and his crew were whisked away to a high-security interrogation center known as the Cage in London, the aircraft became a crime scene. A specialist bomb disposal unit spent hours crawling through the fuselage. Every wire was traced, every panel unscrewed. They worked in agonizing silence, knowing that a single booby-trapped screw could vaporize the hangar. Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, the pressure was suffocating. The British officers grilled Helmers for days. Why now? Who sent you? How many other defectors are coming? They searched for cracks in his story, looking for the telltale signs of a double agent. Helmers, exhausted and stripped of his rank, had to convince a room full of suspicious men that his only motive was a desperate desire to end the slaughter. He had to prove that the stag's horn antennas on the nose weren't decoys, but the actual eyes of the Luftwaffe. The tension reached a breaking point when the British radar experts, the Boffins, finally arrived. They were faced with a choice: trust the word of a man they had been trained to kill, or ignore the most significant piece of intelligence of the war. It was a standoff between the hope of an advantage and the fear of a catastrophe, with the fate of the Allied bomber offensive hanging on whether or not they believed a German pilot's change of heart. The Boffins, from the telecommunications research establishment, didn't take long to realize they weren't looking at a trap, they were looking at a miracle. As they powered up the Lichtenstein FUG 202 radar inside the captured Ju-88, the green glow of the cathode ray tubes revealed the German soul. By analyzing the stag's horn antennas and the internal circuitry, the British engineers finally understood the exact pulse width and frequency the Luftwaffe used to hunt in the dark. This single aircraft provided the golden key. Within weeks, the RAF developed a specific countermeasure, a sophisticated version of window, known today as chaff. These were strips of aluminum foil cut to the precise length required to vibrate at the German radar's frequency. When dropped by the thousands from British Lancasters, they created a massive cloud of false targets. To a German night fighter pilot, it looked like 10,000 bombers had suddenly appeared on his screen. To the German ground controllers, the sky had turned into a blinding wall of static. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. During the next major raid on Hamburg, the Luftwaffe was rendered completely blind. German pilots, who had previously been elite predators, were now flailing in the dark, unable to lock onto a single target. They were forced to watch helplessly as their cities were leveled, their impenetrable defense system reduced to a flickering mess of interference. But the most brilliant part of the resolution was the British silence. The RAF didn't boast about the capture. They kept the Ju-88 hidden in a secluded hangar, repainting it with British roundels and the serial number PJ-876 for secret test flights. The German High Command was left in a state of panicked confusion. They knew their radar was failing, but they couldn't be sure why. Was it a new British invention? Or had there been a leak? Because Helmers and his crew had simply vanished over the North Sea, the Luftwaffe assumed they had crashed. They continued to use the Lichtenstein system for months, funneling their pilots into a tactical trap that the British had already solved. Hans-Joachim Helmers had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He hadn't just saved his own life. He had effectively turned off the lights for the entire Third Reich. The legacy of the Ju-88R1, now known by its British designation PJ-876, is etched into the very foundation of modern military strategy. In the short term, the defection of Helmers and his crew saved thousands of Allied lives. By stripping away the Luftwaffe's night vision, the British were able to continue their strategic bombing campaign with a fraction of the previous casualties. But the long-term impact was even more profound. This single event marked the birth of electronic warfare, EW, as we know it today. Before this incident, air combat was largely a matter of speed, armor, and caliber. After the secrets of the Lichtenstein radar were laid bare, the war shifted into the electromagnetic spectrum. The capture taught the Allies a vital lesson. The most powerful weapon in the sky isn't a gun, it's the ability to manipulate the enemy's perception of reality. The techniques developed to jam the Ju-88's radar evolved directly into the jamming pods and stealth technologies used by modern air forces today. As for the men who made it possible, their story remains a quiet footnote in the grand theater of World War II. After the war, Helmers and his crew didn't return to Germany as heroes. To their former countrymen, they were traitors who had handed over the Reich's most precious shield. To the British, they were valuable assets who eventually slipped into civilian life, their identities often shielded to protect them from retribution. They lived out their lives in the shadow of the monumental choice they made in 1943, a choice to betray their flag in order to save their humanity. The aircraft itself survived the war, eventually finding a home in the RAF Museum at Hendon. Today, it sits silently under the hangar lights, its stag's horn antennas still protruding from its nose like the antlers of a ghost. To the casual observer, it is just a beautifully preserved German bomber. But to those who know the history, it is a monument to the most valuable theft of the century. It stands as a reminder that wars aren't always won by the side with the most bombs, but sometimes by the side that can convince a single pilot to wiggle his wings and lower his landing gear.